Isn't that an incredible film? And I want to give a special shout out to the composer who's in the audience. The music is gorgeous, so congratulations. Thomas Pierre, I believe. I'm very proud to introduce the two next speakers. The director of the prosecutors is Leslie Thomas, the founder of Artworks Projects. She's also a practicing architect and an Emmy Award-winning art director. Her multimedia exhibitions and projections have been seen on 5 continents in dozens of cities and cover a range of human rights topics. And The Prosecutors is her first feature-length documentary. Leslie is a graduate of Columbia University and the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. She's currently in pre-production for Thursday's Child, a micro-budget narrative film about the hard choices women in the 1950s made as they cleared the paths for we travel today. Kate Mackintosh is the inaugural executive director of the Promise Institute for Human Rights at UCLA School of Law. The Promise Institute was founded in 2017 as a West Coast Center for International Human Rights Scholarship, Training, and Advocacy. Mackintosh is a veteran human rights lawyer and leader and has worked for more than 20 years as an advocate and senior executive in the field of human rights, international criminal justice, and protection of civilians. She most recently served in The Hague as Deputy Registrar of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. She previously served as a legal officer at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and has worked on human rights matters in conflict and post-conflict field situations in Bosnia and Herzegovina, Rwanda, and South Sudan. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Leslie Thomas and Kate Mackintosh.
We're just changing it up a little bit here. For the last 5 to 6 years, I've had the privilege and honor of interviewing folks working around the world on ending impunity for conflict-related sexual violence. And I'm incredibly honored to basically do the same thing here with someone whose career is remarkable in this topic. So I asked if I could have the first question. Kate, could you describe to the audience a little bit about legally what we just saw and what is the framing of ending impunity in the legal precedent for identifying rape and other forms of sexual violence as a tool of war?
Sure. So, I mean, many of you might be aware, and I think you highlighted in the film, that the surfacing of sexual violence as an element of conflict and as a criminal element of conflict is relatively recent. So with the establishment of the Yugoslavia and the Rwanda tribunals in 93, 94, initially these cases actually weren't prosecuted. So the initial indictments didn't include charges of sexual violence, which really was quite strange, because if anybody is as old as me and can remember the news that was coming out of Bosnia and the war during the time, there was really quite a lot of attention paid to the sexual violence that was going on. So it made it to the headlines, it made it to the media, but it wasn't making it into the courtroom. And it was actually the actions of a few dedicated individuals and campaigning feminists who lobbied the courts to have the prosecutors pull out this crime and prosecute it in the court. And there's been some really interesting reflective work done by the prosecutors at these courts about why it wasn't happening. And it's really issues like just cultural issues with the prosecutors who wouldn't ask. I mean, they'd be interviewing victims and they wouldn't ask about sexual violence because it was, maybe they felt it was intrusive or embarrassing, or it was just a difficult threshold to cross. So for a number of reasons, that wasn't surfacing. But as I said, it was surfaced, lessons were learnt, and there were some landmark judgments that came down, like the Akayesu judgment from the Rwanda tribunal, which was the first to classify rape or to identify rape as an element of the crime of genocide. And since then, it's also been identified as a way of committing crimes against humanity and as a specific war crime. So all this has been really important, but I think those lessons are still being learnt, and it really comes down to, it's just very interesting. I mean, this is what happens to women in conflict. Violence, like everything else, is gendered. And, men suffer a particular kind of violence and women suffer another kind of violence. And I think we can all imagine if we were being held prisoner, by an enemy and a group of armed enemy men. I mean, women know that we would be subject to sexual violence and men would be beaten. That's just what happens. And so it's still something. I mean, it needs to be surfaced. It's taken a long time. There's been these groundbreaking rulings, but it's still something that has to be very deliberately done and taken into account as a strategy right at the beginning. And that work is still being done and talked about. And that's why it's really, really useful that a film like yours comes out and reinforces that point, because it's not, despite the work of these amazing prosecutors in the film, it's not something which has been achieved yet, I think.
No, and actually to the point about gender, for those of you who haven't heard about the All Survivors organization that came out of UCLA Law School, there is a really terrific international kind of push now to understand that sexual violence crosses, in conflict and out of conflict, crosses all genders. I think we're going to see, as we slowly address sexual violence in conflict in Syria, particularly large numbers of cases of sexual violence against men, and in other countries. But there, the other thing I wondered if you could help us interpret. We heard from Claudia in the introduction about the activity last week at the UN. Germany has had the leadership at the Security Council, and they were putting forward this resolution, and there was quite a bit in the press. Amal Clooney, Nadia Murad, Dennis Mukwege spoke, amongst others. And can you tell us a little bit about the resolution, what went one way and what went the other?
Sure. Well, I mean, I think, so as Claudia alluded to at the beginning, the resolution was watered down in one particular way because of the objection of the United States, and that was this issue of the mentioning of sexual and reproductive health.
And this, to be clear, is a resolution about addressing conflict-related sexual violence.
Oh yeah, thanks, Claudia. Sorry, forgot about that. Yeah, so it's a resolution. So there've been, maybe to just zoom out a little bit, there have been a series of resolutions at the UN Security Council about preventing conflict-related sexual violence, which have been really important, again, in highlighting the issue and drawing attention to it. And of course, these have a preventive intent. This most recent resolution actually had a couple of ambitions. So I think there were two principal ways in which it was disappointing. One was the element that was referred to by Claudia. So that was the reference to sexual and reproductive health, and that picks up on something which was clear in your film, actually, and I wanted to highlight that and maybe ask you about it, which is, we saw, I think, especially in the, I think it was in the Congo case in particular. It was the Congo case, looking at the Heal Africa hospital, the way, an appropriate response to sexual violence is not just legal, right? It's obviously medical, and should be broader than that as well. One of the things, so a victim of sexual violence will need medical attention for a number of reasons. Some of those might be legal in terms of documenting what's happened if he or she wants to take action. But then others will be, the morning after pill, or, PEP, preventative for transmission of HIV, etc. And it's really crucial. And then there'll be psychosocial support and so on. And I think that's the element of the resolution that ended up getting dropped because it was, it's because it's so offensive, right? I think
those of us who are familiar with the global gag rule.
Yeah, exactly, because there was seen as a link with provision of abortion services. The other element that was disappointing about the resolution was that it initially envisaged introducing a monitoring mechanism. So that's that would have been an interesting development. So obviously this film has highlighted domestic prosecutions, which are absolutely crucial. We know that there have been board. Only certain situations are subject to that. So a monitoring mechanism at the level of the Security Council would have been really interesting, because that would have been a mechanism of global application. But that also was removed from the resolution, unfortunately.
Yes, it was interesting. We did a screening. So the open debate was on Tuesday, and we had a screening scheduled on Thursday. Monday afternoon, we had the UK as our main sponsor, which was terrific, kind of, Security Council, very lead. By Wednesday, we had 5 other countries who had jumped on board because there's so much frustration at the UN, at the U.S. watering down and siding with Russia and China. So lots of impact and so forth. I think, as I mentioned, the Korean mission to the UN called the next day and said that they would like to bring the film to Korea to help support their ongoing, decades-long effort to ensure that women who were held as so-called comfort women, sexual slaves, in World War II continue to have advocacy tools and so forth. So we're very honored about that. But people are not relaxed at the UN right now around this topic.
Am I allowed to ask you a question now? Okay, so I have loads of questions. I'm sure you do as well. And any minute now, you'll get a chance to ask. But so, I mean, yeah, there's so many things I'd like to ask you. One thing I noticed was, the film, of course, focuses on the prosecutors, and there's a reason for that. It's about their work. I was interested in the way you dealt with the victims, because we do see, and by the way, I'm using the word victim. I mean, there's victim and survivor. I mean, victim has a legal status, right? So in terms, it seems appropriate here in terms of people that can claim rights in respect to violence that they've suffered. But the victims or survivors do feature, sometimes obliquely, sometimes we see them from the back, we hear their words. Can you talk about your, thought processes and how to handle that as a filmmaker?
Yeah, and I want to make special note that the editor of this film, Christy Deans, is in the room with us. So I'm going to use we a lot because there was a we with the many cinematographers. We shot with 8 people over the course of 5 years, and then Christy and I spent many, many, many months. And these are collaborative decisions. But the first set of decisions were made with the victims and the witnesses. In all the countries we worked with, we sat down and discussed the fact that we were about to make this film. We got their input. There was a collective directive. Each human being is different, but there was a collective directive from all of these victims and their advocacy organizations that they had no need to be interviewed to tell me or you or all of you that they had been sexually violated. They figured we could figure that out. That wasn't intended to be news. What they were very interested in doing is highlighting the fact that there are tools to end impunity and to help them reach justice. And they liked that idea and wanted to be part of that. So that was the first kind of direction. That was the first creative direction, that the film would be called The Prosecutors and we would go down that path. And the second thing is the question of security, agency. When are you being patronizing? When are you being respectful? And these are really hard things, I think, to navigate. For a woman who has never been out of a very small village and has not seen what this would look like, who is trying to decide how much security and how much not, who has to testify in front of the perpetrators who are sitting in back of her in a rural village in Congo at a mobile court. These women did things like said, you can come and film in the waiting room, and you can come and understand how short or tall I am by virtue of the fact that I have kind of a shroud over myself. But I don't want to show my face, though I do know that in my own community, once somebody sees that, it's not going to be too hard to figure out who I am. And we had lots and lots of conversations about that, and I decided that the best thing to do is to let people steer their journey. And these questions become really nuanced. Yasmin Message and I had any number of debates about the victim that you see at the end in the Velika Kladusha case. She has a very patterned shirt on, bright blonde hair. She was very interested in being filmed and telling her story and felt that she had been doing this for decades and was now very excited that justice looked within reach. He kept saying, it's too dangerous, it's too dangerous. It isn't dangerous for her. The question is sort of stigma and her reputation. So he and I debated this, and he lost and I won because it was hers. It was her decision to make. And I thought it was very interesting when I got the footage and she had that shirt on, which is extremely identifiable in a small town. He and I were recently in The Hague with Amani, And he's sort of looking at it, and I was like, this isn't yours to make. This is hers. She's an adult. Do you know that you've got it right? No, you don't know. You never know. There is always risk. But I think in a collaborative filmmaking documentary process, you will get the best navigation of agency.
Can I ask how you picked those 3 situations?
With a lot of advice from mutual friends, advisors, legal experts, like a woman named Patricia Sellers, a judge from Bosnia, an American judge from Bosnia named Patty Whalen. We wanted to show a couple of things. We wanted to show that while humanity loves to other people, it's like our favorite thing to do. Not us, but you people do X or Y or Z. We wanted to be on 3 different continents with 3 different ethnic groups, so that if you were watching this, it would be impossible to say, well, people like me don't do this. It was just sort of very visual and visceral. The other thing we wanted to say is that justice doesn't have a timeline. In Congo, they are doing these cases while there is conflict. But it also is never too cold. Yasmin is slogging away at this. The cases are 20 years old. There's not much trail. And he is basically calling out the ghosts and rebuilding the justice system for these survivors. And in Colombia, it's this really fascinating situation where they've gone through this very public justice and peace process, kind of a truth and reconciliation. And guys like Marco Tulio Perez simply lied. He went into the process and he said, I never used sexual violence, and then said everybody was lying. And it's sort of a perfect chance, we thought, to show that you can have those processes, but if someone abuses it, that there's a safety net. And that was kind of our thought.
Yeah, I thought they were a fantastic combination in terms of showing the breadth. And the 3 trials that you, although, well, there was more than 3 trials, but the 3, national processes that you follow were all very different. I mean, what's it like observing those trials?
Hot. All the time. Always, unless it was cold. It was a privilege. It was long. It was grueling. It was, and if it was that for us, for participants, it was indescribable. I would say this, and then maybe we'll see if anybody has any questions. You can't underestimate that due process is complicated. Sometimes there's no generator, there's no lunch, there's no water, there's no defense attorney. People travel for thousands of miles, and then the hearing is called because there's no defense attorney, or there was no power, so the defense team didn't get the evidence, and so therefore you don't have justice. And I was endlessly impressed by the commitment on all sides, even if the outcome wasn't what everybody wanted, to make sure that justice had a fullness, for lack of a better way to describe it.
Fantastic. Shall we see if anybody from the audience wants to ask a question? Yes.
Not to travel away from what you're discussing, but Leslie, this one is for you. Can you speak a little bit about what was mentioned, your next project, which I think is Thursday's Child?
So a number of us who are working on this film decided that we should do another film that had a very strong feminist focus, in this case narrative, shot in the 1950s. So we are going to try to take this skill set and do a very small story with, we hope, a big impact about the first steps of feminism and agency during the atomic age, set outside of Edwards Air Force Base. It's kind of interesting to go very micro about a big topic after going very macro.
Picking up on the thread of the feminist viewpoint, I thought it was so fascinating. I was very surprised, frankly, to see all the women that were on the prosecutorial team in Colombia. Did you know that going in? Was that part of your screening process in terms of determining who you were going to feature as you went into this project? I mean, I just wasn't expecting that. As a former attorney, I was just very surprised to see the number of all the women that were involved.
And it's interesting, we originally thought about doing this in Guatemala, where many of you know about Claudia Paz's work, and there, again, in the Sepper Zarco case and so forth, there's a lot of women. No, I wish I was that smart, and I'm not. We did say that we were going to follow 2 female identifying prosecutors and 1 male. That was a very specific decision. We need allies, across the gender spectrum. So we didn't want to show not only, but 3 female prosecutors, because we wanted to make sure that this is not gendered in how justice works. And then when we got to Colombia, it was really very exciting. And it's funny because Sandra Moreno was the number 2 prosecutor behind Giovanna, who starts, and then she had to move on, and some things happened in her career. So a woman started that case, and another woman took it over and brought it home to closure. And the judge and the judge's clerk, and so on and so forth, who are fantastic.
So kind of a similar question on the gendered aspect. Hi, over here. Hi, Kate. I'm one of Kate's students at UCLA Law School, so this is very exciting. But my question on the gendered aspect was just, did you see a difference between interacting with the female prosecutors and the male prosecutor? Because in the film, it seems like they had the same level of passion and the same kind of, if not strategy, commitment and basic steps that they took. So I'm just wondering, in your interactions with them, if you saw a difference.
No, I didn't, actually. I saw an enormous number of people incredibly committed. But I would like to get Kate's take on this, because a little bit we're late to the party, right? We started filming this 5 years ago. This is post-Akayesu, which we talked about. I mean, Akayesu, the sexual violence component of this came from the judge sort of saying, hey, by the way, we have rape as a form of genocide in that case, and you didn't bring the charge. So maybe Kate's take on whether there previously might have been more difference?
Yeah, I think all the leaders in that. So that was Navi Pillay, the president of that court, who put that in. But she was lobbied by feminist groups to do that. Actually, I mean, not to, I don't mean to suggest that she didn't behave in a judicial fashion, but there was some activism around that, and she looked at the facts and she realised that there was, legally there was something she felt was missing. I do think the leaders in surfacing sexual violence have. I mean, if I think of the people who have been very active, I think they have all been women. But, I mean, I was just thinking, actually, I was looking at a publication in preparation for this evening. I had a look at something which was produced by a fantastic former colleague of mine, Michelle Jarvis, who is now the deputy head of the investigative mechanism for Syria, and who was the deputy prosecutor at the Yugoslavia Tribunal. And she co-edited a book which takes the stories of her colleagues reflecting from the Yugoslavia Tribunal on the lessons that they learnt. And I just noticed, I was just looking through, I mean, it's a really interesting book. It's a fantastic resource, and that was the idea. It's a kind of legacy sort of gift from that tribunal, which has closed now, to successive prosecutors. But, I mean, for example, the contributors to that book are both male and female. So, I mean, I think at this stage, there are lots of very committed male prosecutors who understand the importance of that and are spearheading those efforts. So, I guess.
I think also there's a piece that's interesting. There's an organization called Women's Initiatives for Gender Justice that's running a kind of a campaign or a survey right now called Call It What It Is, right? So if you're on the kinds of Twitter networks that we are on and so forth, there's a lot of conversation about what are we even talking about. That's why we, what is sexual violence domestically is hard to define from a judicial point of view. What is it in conflict? What does it mean to use it strategically? When does it include trafficking, slavery, forced marriage, forced pregnancy? Is penetration involved? What is sex? Sexual violence in conflict, right, is the term that we use. It doesn't roll off the tongue, but rape in war doesn't actually mean anything, right? Or it's very, very limited. What is rape and what is war? So all this stuff is still getting defined, and the case law around it is getting defined. And so judges and prosecutors and defense attorneys are trying to navigate this in conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there's more questions, but I just wanted to jump in actually with something that I wanted to mention, and you might have been leading me towards it with your first question. I didn't answer it, but also reminded me, talking about the team of female prosecutors in Colombia, because one of them actually is a former colleague of mine, and I had no idea she was involved in that, Daniela Kravitz. Yeah. So I was like, oh, I didn't know she was working in Colombia. She's actually from Chile herself. But the interesting thing is the interplay between the international and the domestic prosecutions in many ways. So like people, you know, she was my colleague at the Yugoslavia Tribunal, and now I see that she's prosecuting domestically in Chile. But also the lessons that are learned. I mean, there's very formally a role for, you know, the International Criminal Court. The whole idea of that construct is that states that sign up are committing to prosecute those crimes themselves, right? With the
U.S. is not a signatory,
Yeah.
just a reminder.
Yeah, with the International Criminal Court as a fallback. So there's that relationship. But then there's also the lessons that are learned. And I was reminded by the witness support people in Bosnia, the woman who was speaking from the witness support organization in Bosnia, and I know that organization, and there's also one in Croatia and Serbia, and that's psychological support to victims, not necessarily of sexual violence, to any victims of crime that need that psychological support, but it's attached to the war crimes courts, and it's absolutely crucial in helping people talk about, you know, it doesn't have to be sexual violence, it can be seeing your children killed in front of you, or, you know, other terrible traumatic events. And that's something that was developed in the international tribunals and which has been replicated domestically, you know. And so there's all sorts of learning that goes both ways, and I just think that's really interesting. And you can have also a domestic jurisdiction which comes up with some really innovative or, you know, significant addition to the process that can then be reabsorbed into the international. So it's yeah, I thought that's an interesting thing to highlight.
Groups like Médica Zenica, Mujeres por la Paz, there's a number of them in Congo. I mean, we have a lot of them on our website. You know, all of these organizations are working in this wonderful zone between sort of individual cases and individual defendants and victims and witnesses and the courts, and trying to help navigate that space.
Making sure it's on. My friend and I just finished our studies in international relations at Pepperdine and just got a small taste of how our field really gets to study the best things in the world, but also the worst things in the world. And so I really appreciated how the prosecutors, spoke a little bit to their personal feelings about their work. So I'm wondering how each of you deal with the weight of the cases in the field that you're involved in.
Yeah, I must say actually that when the film started, I felt, oh God. My heart actually really sank, because now I work at UCLA, so it's not as traumatic, although, you know, it has its, obviously. But no, I mean, sorry, I don't mean to make light of it, but no, and especially actually, I worked for the Yugoslavia Tribunal for a number of years, but also lived in Bosnia for a time, and I didn't live in Congo, but I lived in Rwanda, which was next door, and it's very similar. It looks, you know, that Kivu region, it looks very much the same. And I must say, I felt a bit of a like, oh, it's very painful. Yeah, I think when you're in that work, though, I mean, when you're in that work, I think your professional mission is, in a way, your protection, right? Because you have a reason for being there, and you're trying to achieve something, and that's what enables you to deal with it. You feel you're responding. I mean, in a way, it's almost easier to be there with a professional mission than not, right? Just as an observer, because you don't have the feeling of helplessness. And then I also think it's a protection or a barrier in another way, in that you can get very focused on, you know, like you probably started thinking about lighting and what, you know, I don't know, you know, and as a lawyer, I think you're thinking about evidence and, you know, that's not really going to work, and we need this bit, and it can help you take some distance from the situation. Yeah.
As I'm not a lawyer, and always an observer, I think that after, 13, 14, 15 years of kind of working in multimedia spaces around grave human rights abuses, I always leave. I have the privilege of leaving. It's not a privilege. I mean, because sometimes it's very hard to leave, but I go back to an extremely comfortable life. And I'm very clear about that. And oftentimes, the place that I'm leaving is going to be decades before those kinds of privileges are provided. But the takeaway for me is to not take myself so seriously. My children and my husband continually remind me that when I roll my eyes about their complaints, because perhaps what I heard last week somewhere else seemed more grave, that I need to reorient and reboot and remember that it's always about context. I will also say this. I found and have always found great joy in the places that I work. I have found great intelligence. I have found so many lessons and so much that inspires me and educates me. And so I hope that the story that we've told in this film is an aspirational story, that folks watching it will say, wow, I have so much to learn from women in Colombia and women in Bosnia and women in Congo. And if we up our game, fill in the blank of wherever you live, we might achieve some of that. So I think that it's very important to go to places like this and have your mind as open as possible. Because if you go saying that you are coming here to bring some education to folks, you're going to find yourself sorely missing out.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's so true. That's actually something that was at the back of my mind when I was, when you started speaking as well. Because, of course, wherever you are, you're also, I mean, if you're in Colombia, there's also like great music, cheap beer. Rwanda is one of the most beautiful countries I've ever been to. I mean, it's very, of course, multi-dimensional experience, right? So you've also got that at the same time.
The media flattens things.
Exactly, yeah. And you've got that at the same time as you're dealing with something which is, pretty heavy. There's also just life, right?
So, thank you. I was curious about the woman in Bosnia who kind of mid-film came forward. And I was wondering, it almost felt like she became aware of this articulation of this crime. I'm wondering what the circumstances were for her to come forward. And I'm also wondering, with this film and this articulation and this visibility of this as a crime, if we will reopen Srebrenica and Vukovar, and if the cases will be reopened, if there's energy for it, if there's interest, if there's resources, like what this will do for war crimes, the courts that have just finished.
Well, I can speak very briefly to the woman, and I think Kate, on the larger framing of where we stand. This particular woman had been telling her story from the time that she was raped. The challenge was not that people didn't hear, but that she kept running into a lack of mechanism. As Kate explained, the ICTY and then later the ICC were not designed to kind of clean up every single case. There's all kinds of reasons that certain cases happened. And then after the ICTY, in Bosnia, we have the state court of BIH, Sud BIH. The entity courts, this sort of local prosecutor on the corner in your town, is very new. And it's incredibly exciting because now someone like this woman does not have to go to Sarajevo, does not have to have her case chased all the way up to Sarajevo to be addressed. And so she had come forward and come forward and come forward, but this time there was somebody to listen. So she's very excited about this. She is very angry about what happened, and she's very much looking forward to the process of addressing the crime. I think it's been a positive experience for her so far. The case is not finished yet.
And so the second part of your question was whether cases that have already been adjudicated but haven't perhaps prosecuted sexual violence, was that the idea, whether they be reopened? So I don't know about reopened, but I mean, the Yugoslavia Tribunal certainly won't be trying anymore. But any fact that hasn't been adjudicated can be adjudicated still in the courts.
There's no statute of limitations on war crimes.
Exactly, can be adjudicated in the courts that Leslie's referring to. And, as we saw from Jasmine, is very active. But I mean, there are quite a few very dedicated prosecutors working in those courts. I mean, especially, you know, in Bosnia, Serbia, and Croatia. I mean, Serbia, they're suffering a little from, you know, I wouldn't say either Serbia or Croatia. There's like massive political will behind them. But the war crimes prosecutors themselves are fantastic.
And you know, Jasmin has prided himself, for example, on his relationship with the Serbian prosecutorial team. They don't have extradition between a lot of these countries. So what Jasmin will do is kind of investigate a case, wrap it up, and send it to another country and say, look, this guy lives here. I know he is. I know where he is. This is the evidence. You need to prosecute it. And really kind of, and then say, I will do the same, you know. So there's some informal mechanisms. I would also say that Kosovo, for those who are interested, is really trying to get their game together and learn from Bosnia and other countries and kind of move forward. The film this summer will be in Montenegro, Serbia, Bosnia, Kosovo, and I assume we will get to Albania, but you know, we're sort of doing a tour there. And also through Central Africa and so on and so forth, but particularly in Bosnia. I think you'll see this at the local level. So forth.
This question is for Leslie. I wanted to ask if you ran into any kind of difficulties when filming, like getting access, let's say, in the military courts or anything like that.
So it's really, really interesting. You might think that in the sort of peaceful and non-currently conflicted states that you would have the most transparency and the most access. But actually, I have been thrown out of more Bosnian courts than in anywhere, and had the most access in Congo, excuse me. Quite a bit of access in Colombia, the most access in Congo, in a place where these military mobile courts are being held during conflict. Our footage is actually the best from a court in Congo because of it, because you could put a camera person anywhere. Everyone is allowed to see what's going on. The cases move around. They're tried. That's why they're called mobile courts, which aren't really much different than a circuit court was in the United States in the early part of this country's history. Colombia has a lot of access. Bosnia has really struggled with transparency. We would regularly, you know, be invited in and then be told 5 minutes into the case that all the media had to leave. And it's a terrible problem because Bosnia has kind of frozen. I mean, you'll have opinions about this, you know, in moving on to the next generation. And I think that's really an issue.
Hi, Leslie. Did you and your crew feel threatened at all, especially with so much military?
Yes, but compared to the victims and witnesses who are testifying, it's very difficult to focus on that because it's so clear that in particularly cases like Colombia still and Congo definitely, what they were sacrificing to testify was just incredible. We did have an interesting situation once in the footage where we were going out to Libertad in Colombia. This was hotly debated whether this trip could happen for a long time, and we're going back and forth. And I speak fairly lousy Spanish, but just enough to know when people are kind of nervous about something. And finally I said, you keep talking about this plan pistola thing and blah, blah, blah. What does that mean? And somebody's like, oh, well, there may or may not be a plan pistola in the area, and that means that they're going to shoot anybody first and then ask questions later. So we're all sort of sitting around like, okay. So then we're organizing the car rental, and they said, well, there's two kinds of trucks you can get. One is bulletproof, but it'll be slower if you have to leave. And one isn't bulletproof, but you'll be able to drive faster and get out. I let the crew decide. I said, I'll rent either one. But basically, people are very kind and generous and shockingly brave. I mean, it is Amani Kahatwa and the entire ABA Rowley team has been threatened for all of the time they do this. Their children have been targeted, their families. And when you ask them, why do you keep doing this? They just look at you like, that is the stupidest question I've ever heard. Because it's our job. Somebody has to do it, and why not me? So it's very inspiring, and you just take great strength from it.
Which car did you pick?
The faster one.
Anyone else on the other side?
Well, I just thank you so much, Leslie. Fantastic to meet you, and a wonderful film.
Thank you very much.
everybody.
Thank you for coming. And I would like to thank the Hammer for having us.